I'm excited for this class. It is going to be difficult to fit everything in Hebrews in 4 weeks, but we'll do our best to make it work. I'll definitely hit on some big themes for sure. I love the book of Hebrews. Really excited for this. I was trying to think about last year during Lent, we did the Gospel of Mark, which I think worked really well. It was like following Jesus to the cross during the season of Lent. I think Hebrews is also a really good Lenten book because it's about the wandering wilderness people of God, right? We're following God. I mean, that's the main image of the people of God in Hebrews is you're with God in the wilderness following the tabernacle, as it were. But the tabernacle is actually the heavenly tabernacle, and Jesus is your high priest. So that image of going somewhere together as we reflect on what Jesus has done for us, I think that works really well for Lent. So I'm hoping that also ties in nicely to it. Aside from that, I just think Hebrews is one of the coolest books in the New Testament. It's up there with my favorite. I think it's one of the most important books for Christian theology, both in terms of the doctrine of God is Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and in terms of soteriology, what salvation looks like. So I'm really excited to dive in with you there. And the other piece, of course, is that Hebrews is probably one of the trickiest books to understand. It's a complex running argument that draws a lot on Old Testament imagery, and in particular on the sacrificial worship from the Old Testament, which is not always the most familiar to us. How many of you spend your time in Leviticus for your morning devotionals, right? A couple people, hey, kudos to you. Leviticus is fantastic, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. And we're going to have to talk about Leviticus when we get to some parts of Hebrews, because it's important. It's kind of the backstory for what's going on. So I'm looking forward to that. What we're going to do tonight is give you some background on the book. I know there's going to be some questions that people might have, like who the heck wrote Hebrews? And so we'll kind of walk through that. And then we're going to look at the first 2 chapters. And that in itself might be a little bit ambitious. So I'm not promising we'll get through all of chapter 2, but that's kind of what we're aiming at, okay? And the notes and the PowerPoint gives you all the information there. So if you don't touch on every last verse, you have resources to go back and to turn to. All right. So let's begin with the question of authorship. Who wrote the letter to the Hebrews, or is it a letter? That's another thing we have to try to unpack. The simple answer to this question was given by the 3rd century church father Origen of Alexandria, later moved to Caesarea, and he is remembered as saying this, quoted by a different church father. So it's like Origen according to Eusebius. When he was asked who wrote Hebrews, he said, well, God knows. Now, in fact, Origen, I think, thought Paul wrote Hebrews. Whenever he quotes from Hebrews in his writings, he always says, as according to St. Paul or something of that nature. But he is kind of being, I think, a little bit facetious. And it's pointing to the fact that there was some dispute within the early church in terms of who exactly wrote this text. And the easiest way to think about it, and I give you some different examples in your handout as well, and I'll have some up here on the board. But at a very broad general level, if we're looking at how Hebrews was received in the early church, you have a bit of a split geographically between Eastern Church and Western Church. So the Eastern Church was primarily the Greek-speaking church. And when we look at the church fathers in those regions, they tend to assume or argue that Paul wrote Hebrews. Within the West, there's a little bit more of a debate. A number of early Western church fathers say Paul didn't write Hebrews. And so that's where some of the early kind of debate comes in. And that leads to a bunch of different questions in terms of authorship. So if it's not Paul, right, and I think there's some good reasons for why it wouldn't be Paul, and I'll share those in a moment. But if it's not Paul, then basically what you get is a grab bag of like other biblical figures that people know about that are associated with Paul. And why might that be? Well, at the end of this text, the only part of Hebrews which approximates to a letter is the ending of this text, right? You have a kind of letter ending. And in that letter ending, Timothy is mentioned. And we all know, of course, Timothy was Paul's younger delegate associated with Paul. So that leads then to speculation about who else in the Pauline circle might have written this text, right? And again, we could come back to really only God knows. But these are some of the other suggestions that some early church fathers make and then others. One suggestion, because people did realize, Eastern fathers realized this as well, that this text does feel different than Paul's letters, right? And so one suggestion was like, well, maybe this was like Paul's preaching kind of translated by Luke, if you will. That was one way that some people tried to get the Pauline essence of Hebrews, but account for the linguistic differences. Maybe Luke did it, because we know Luke is a really skilled writer. And if we look at the Greek in the New Testament, the best Greek is basically Hebrews and Luke Acts, right? So that's one suggestion. There's nothing concrete to connect Luke to Hebrews, but that was one. Of course, we know Barnabas was one of Paul's missionary companions. So Tertullian, early Western church father, said maybe Barnabas wrote Hebrews. There is a letter, it's not included in the New Testament, but it was quite popular in the early church, called the Letter of Barnabas. It's a 2nd century text, was not written by Barnabas, but it claims to be. So we know that some people were connecting things with this figure, who was a famous companion of Paul. Another Pauline companion was Silas or Silvanus. We see him mentioned in the letters as well. That was another suggestion. Clement of Rome. This one gets thrown around. The first text that we have that shows awareness of Hebrews, that appears to be not necessarily quoting from Hebrews, but using language that suggests this text knew Hebrews, is a letter called First Clement. Also not included in the New Testament, but a very popular letter in the early church. It was written right at the end of the 1st century or early 2nd century by a leader in Rome to the churches in Corinth, kind of like what Paul does when he writes to the churches in Corinth. And this letter, First Clement, shows clear awareness of Hebrews. So it actually is important because it allows us to have an endpoint in terms of the dating of Hebrews. So that's one that also sometimes gets thrown around. Believe it or not, Martin Luther suggested Apollos. He's just, again, another church figure we know about. I think the logic being, well, Apollos shows up in Acts. He's a highly trained, skilled orator from Alexandria, this, learned city, right? So maybe Luther, throws out, maybe it's Apollos. And then probably one of the more interesting suggestions, the modern scholar Adolf von Harnack picked up on a suggestion that one person had made, that maybe the husband and wife team, Aquila and Priscilla, wrote this or something like that. Again, these are all people just connected with Paul, so people are throwing out different options. And he suggested, well, maybe because she's a woman, they kind of brushed that aside or something like that. All of this, again, is highly speculative. So the only thing we can come back to concretely is really what Origen says at the beginning. Only God knows. So it's a very interesting text in that respect. Well, I'll say something about the Pauline thing in a minute, but let me just read a quote from Jerome. This just kind of illustrates, after you have this initial early period in the church where there is some debate about who wrote it, it does tend to settle down, for all intents and purposes, that it's a Pauline text. And that doesn't really get questioned again vigorously until the Reformation, until people like Luther and Calvin and others come along. So this is what Jerome writes. We must admit that the epistle written to the Hebrews is regarded as Paul's not only by the churches of the East, but by all writers who have from the beginning written in Greek. So he's acknowledging that within the Greek tradition, it's pretty uniform in terms of thinking about this text as being Pauline. This is the earliest copy we have of Hebrews, and you can see the top right there, which I put a little box around, that just says to the Hebrews. This is from Papyrus 46, dates to about 200 AD. And it is a letter collection of Paul's letters. So Hebrews shows up right after Romans. So you can see two things here. One is within the tradition, you're having Hebrews received as a Pauline letter, as a Pauline text, and as a letter. Paul writes letters. So the difference between Hebrews and Paul's letters are Paul writes his letters to locations, right? So the titles that they get out of the letters come from what's said in the letter. Paul's greeting the holy ones in Corinth, and so they add the title to the Corinthians. In the case of Hebrews, there's no audience that's designated in the text. It doesn't say what region, what location, who the audience is. So this is actually an inference from the content of the document. They're a kind of an assumption, right? Like, okay, we're going to make this into a letter, give it a title, the way we have Paul's other letters titled. And who is it written to? Well, a lot of Old Testament language involved here, sacrifice, all this kind of stuff. So we're going to call it to the Hebrews. So that's kind of how that gets designated there. Again, there's some issues with this, but this just illustrates the Pauline reception of this text. Okay, before I talk about audience, let me just point out why the vast majority of scholars today do not think Paul wrote Hebrews, and then I'll open it up to questions if you like. So there's a couple reasons. Some of you have already pointed out, it feels very different than Paul's letters, different stylistically. And that's always tricky because do we have enough data really to know what Paul's style is? It kind of changes in some cases from letter to letter. Even that being so, the Greek of Hebrews is quite different than anything we find in Paul's letters. It's very different. In terms of the theology, it's not that they're not incompatible, but Hebrews does seem to be doing some different things that we don't ever see emphasized as much in Paul's letters, right? So it would just be a very different angle on Paul's theological thought if Hebrews were Pauline. The biggest one for me, I think this is the big kind of smoking gun. When Hebrews the author discusses his or her, identity, there are these hints that they are not part of the first group of apostles, that they're a second generation removed. They've had things handed on to them from the apostles. There are these little hints in Hebrews that suggest the writer is not positioning him or herself as an apostle per se. And of course, that wouldn't be unusual for the New Testament. Luke is not an apostle, for example, right? He tells you he's not at the opening of Luke. So it's not entirely out of step, but it's hard to imagine Paul not claiming, hey, it's me, Paul, the apostle. And I think that's probably the biggest reason why, aside from the stylistic differences, that Hebrews is very unlikely to be a Pauline text. I'll stop there and just see if anybody has any questions. I know this is always the one thing that people want to know about, who wrote Hebrews.
Your opinion.
Yeah. Yeah.
On the author.
Yeah. So my opinion is I don't think we can know who wrote it. I think we can rule out Paul. Beyond that, I think it's very difficult to know who wrote it. And in terms of, its reception into the canon or theologically, I don't think it's a huge problem. It doesn't claim to be written by Paul. If you were going to argue that the writer's trying to claim to be Paul, the only thing you have to hang your hat on really is the mention of Timothy at the end, which seems kind of thin to me. So I don't think it needs to have been written by Paul. I think it's another complement to Paul's letters. And in terms of the way things come into the canon, I think it is the case that its association with Paul's letters are part of the reason why. But I don't think that would be the only reason, and certainly not a reason to get rid of it or whatever. You can find some radical fringe people that will say things like, well, if it's not written by Paul, you got to take it out of the canon. I would never say that. I think it's a really important contribution to the canon, and I don't think it has to be ever written by Paul. Okay, so again, a little bit on authorship. We just don't know. It's interesting kind of in that respect. In terms of the audience, this is also kind of interesting. Well, that's also part of the reason why I showed this, right, is where are they getting this idea of to the Hebrews, this title that gets added on? This is the earliest copy we have. This title is not original, right, to the text. The title is based on a judgment of who's the audience. And the audience is inferred from the contents of the text. So here's kind of the main line of thinking. And I think that you can make arguments for both. Certainly it is the case that you can find even in some early church fathers a suggestion that Hebrews is kind of like this text written to, well, you have different suggestions, written to Jews in Jerusalem or maybe Jewish Christ followers in Jerusalem, either to persuade them to move away from the sacrificial practices or something like that, or to persuade them that, hey, yeah, Jesus is the way, not this kind of thing. That seems a little bit thin to me. Where I think you can get a little bit more mileage on this suggestion is some scholars have suggested, if you look at things like in Hebrews 13, when it talks about meeting Jesus outside the gate of the city, going outside, is it possible that Hebrews is being written just before or just after the destruction of the temple? So could it be that it's encouraging them to kind of move away from Jerusalem at a time where it's about to be destroyed? Or perhaps the temple has been destroyed, and that's a pretty cataclysmic, traumatic event. And part of the reminder of the sermon is, well, our ultimate temple is actually in heaven, and that's where Jesus is located, right? So these are different ideas that people throw out. I still tend to lean towards the latter option, though, that it's written to churches in Rome. The writer sends greetings from Italy, so likely written in the region of Rome or thereabouts. Our earliest reception of Hebrews, as I mentioned, was First Clement, a text written from Rome. And we know that the Roman churches were majority Gentile, but also made up of Jewish believers. And the idea that a text that has a lot of Old Testament references has to be a text for Jews also kind of strikes me as weird when you start to think about it. Paul writes letters mostly to Gentiles, and they're saturated with quotations from the Old Testament. I'm guessing most of us here are Gentiles, non-Jewish believers, right? You all like the Old Testament? You read it? Okay, good. So apparently the Old Testament isn't just for Jews. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that just because this text, it's filled with sacrificial imagery and so forth, that it necessarily is for Jews only. There's also references to like dead works and things like that, which is a very common way of Jews talking about turning away from idolatry, talking to Gentiles about turning away from idolatry. So again, do we know the audience exactly? No, the audience is also unknown, but these are the two major ideas. Ultimately, I agree with Craig Kester. I don't think it's necessary to try to nail down one specific ethnic group that's being, targeted in this. I think you can see the letter as potentially, or this text as being potentially broader than that. But if I had to guess, I would guess probably the churches in Rome as the initial audience. Okay, one more thing that I think is kind of interesting about Hebrews. I've been calling it a letter, and then you probably noticed I backpedaled off of that a few times. It's because it's really not. Hebrews, and I have a quote for you about this in your notes. It's actually the first bullet point under genre. So I didn't make a slide. I didn't duplicate it on the slide. But the point is, okay, so when we think about letters and speeches, which Hebrews is kind of more of a speech or a sermon, and that's typically how it's classified. And the reason for that is because at the end, the writer says, you've listened to my word of exhortation. And that word of exhortation is the same kind of speech we see when Paul's giving a sermon in the synagogue in Acts 13. So it's a kind of, there's definitely overlap between letter writing and speeches, insofar as both are written to be publicly performed, right? If I have a letter or a sermon, I'm reading it before the congregation and expositing it. So there's a lot of similarity and overlap there. But in terms of how Hebrews imagines what's going on, all of the references are to speech, to speaking. The audience is exhorted throughout. Almost like if you're listening to a long sermon and getting a little sleepy at a few points, the writer or the speaker like kind of wakes you up. Like, I have some really cool things I want to share with you guys, but you're too dull in understanding, and to kind of like wake them up. And then he does share it with them, this stuff about Melchizedek. So in terms of how it's imagined, it's a running sermon, right? You can imagine this as being like, if you're in an early church congregation and you're sitting and listening to Hebrews it's a running argument through and through. And that's kind of the way to think about it. And then the ending is kind of just the epistolary ending, kind of letter ending that's tacked on so that this text can get passed on, from one group to the next. But otherwise, it's very much just like it reads kind of like a speech. The writer is drawing on classical rhetorical forms, and it's really quite beautiful, actually, the way it unfolds. All right. You guys ready to dive into the text now? Okay, good. That's what I'm most excited to do. The opening, okay, this is my opinion, but I don't think it can be disputed. I think the opening of Hebrews is the coolest opening of any book we have in the New Testament. And I think the writer thought very carefully about exactly how he or she wanted to open it, and it's really quite beautiful. And if you can get this opening, you kind of get the whole message in a nutshell, too. It's like the first 4 verses. So the technical term that's used sometimes is the exordium. This is the opening kind of thesis, drawing you into the text. This is Hebrews 1 through 4. And this is what I mean by this is such a cool opening, right? The Greek is polymeros kai polytropos polai. So you can hear the P sounds repeated over and over in many and various ways long ago. Isn't that a cool opening? I mean, like, you just don't get that in many texts, right? You can see how intense. So it's polymeros kai polytropos asin pois prophetai. So if you keep reading, you even get more of those P sounds. And I wrote it out for you in Greek, so you can see that in your notes. You can just imagine sitting in the synagogue, sitting in the church, and just hearing the sound kind of roll off of the speaker's lips as they begin. So what's going on in the opening? Really, really important. We've got this foundational claim about God's speech. And this is really important. Hebrews is about the word of God, God's speech. You're hearing the word of God brought forth. And God's speaking now definitively. So we'll look at that more here in the next slide in a second. But it's about the definitive nature of God's speech now speaking by the Son. Then we've got a supporting argument, which is a collection of Old Testament texts woven together. And so we'll unpack some of the logic here. But what's going on with these Old Testament texts is the support for what's being said about the Son. Who is this Son, and what makes him different, and what are we saying about him being enthroned at the right hand of God? So all of these texts are woven together from the Old Testament. Really powerful stuff here about Jesus. In fact, if you are ever in a place where you need to demonstrate to somebody the divinity of Jesus, Hebrews 1 would be the first place I would go outside of the opening of John's Gospel. And if you go back and look at how the doctrine of the Trinity, when they were arguing about things and needing to demonstrate that, Hebrews 1 played a huge role in that. And you're going to see why that's the case as we go through this. And then we get the first of a series of warning texts. We'll talk about these more next week as we get into the wilderness period. Hebrews is punctuated by these warning passages. In light of what God has done, don't grow weary in the faith, continue on. It's like an undulating argument where you get theological argument and then warning to hold fast. More theological argument, warning to hold fast. So the message of Hebrews, the kind of so what message, is basically persevere. You could summarize it in that way. But the reason why we can persevere is what's explored in the theological argument of this sermon. All right, so let me read the opening four verses here, and then we're going to unpack them. We'll spend a little bit of time here because this is really, really important stuff. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets. In these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. And you can translate that as the Son. Either way, it's clear that he's distinct. By a Son whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he created the worlds. He, still speaking of the Son, is a reflection of God's glory, the exact imprint of his very being, and he sustains all things by his powerful word. When he had made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to the angels as the name he inherited is more excellent than theirs. That right there is kind of the theological argument of Hebrews in a nutshell. So let's unpack what's being said here. You see at the very beginning, right? It's all divine speech. It's the word of God, but it's being divided up into like two modes of divine speech. We have in various ways long ago versus now in these last days. These last days were a common way of Jews of the time referring to that kind of penultimate inbreaking period of the new age coming in. So from a Christian perspective, Jesus has been raised from the dead. The Spirit has been poured out. Peter says at Pentecost, we're in the last days, right? So it makes perfect sense. Now it's kind of the decisive moment of divine revelation. In the past, in these last days, God spoke to past audience, our ancestors, now us. We're the direct recipients. And then lastly, the mode or the manner of divine speech by the prophets versus now by the Son. What's really interesting is if you read that opening, you might think like, okay, we're kind of leaving the old behind and moving on to something else. What you find in Hebrews is it's all the writing of the prophets and the Psalms. But the definitive key is the Son helps you understand what's really being said in these texts. So all of this, what we're going to read on from verse 5 onwards is divine speech. God speaking, but it's God the Father speaking to the Son. And so we're having like the preacher expositing for us all of these, what we would call Old Testament texts, where there's actually a conversation among the persons of the Trinity, the Father speaking to the Son. So it's like the Son kind of opens up the fullness of God's divine speech that had been in the prophetic writings. And he's said to be heir of all things. So Jesus is the one through whom God creates, the Father creates through the Son, is what's said. But he also is heir of all things as the first human raised from the dead. He's the one who goes ahead of us, right? In terms of, so it's both divinity and humanity kind of coming together here already. Hebrews is gesturing to it, presupposing Jesus' relationship with the Father prior to his incarnation, prior to taking on our humanity. But really the sermon is meditating on the end point of that, him taking on our humanity and being raised from the dead and coming before God the Father as our representative. And it's that full sweep that we're getting at the open. So heir of all things, he's the heir of all things and the one through whom, prior to anything else, the Father made the world or the worlds. And I do think it's helpful to have The plural, it does say plural in here in the Greek, either worlds or ages. That's intentional. The idea is there's this present age, which is dying and decaying, and then the new creation, the new world, the age to come. And it's into that new world that the Son enters in his resurrection and enthronement. And that's the world that we are all entering into. The writer of Hebrews is going to describe that as God's ultimate rest. So he actually reads Genesis, believe it or not. We're going to see this next week. He reads Genesis as establishing not only the present creation, but the creation of the world to come, the ultimate rest. And so that's why I think there's the mention at the outset of the two ages, both of which were created through the Son. So we've got these two modes of speech, and then this is really cool too. In Greek, this is all one long sentence. And what I've tried to do here is highlight for you what the main action or event is in the Greek. The main action or event, the verb that's highlighted, is that Jesus sat down at the right hand of God. That's kind of like the definitive thing that Hebrews is focused on. It's a sermon or a meditation on the implications of Jesus being seated at the right hand of God. But it's not just anybody who's seated at the right hand of God, it's who he is. So it's both who he is and where he is that's so important for Christian theology. Beginning with who he is prior to his incarnation. So he says he's being the reflection of God, glory of an exact imprint of God from the very beginning, and bearing all things together by his powerful word. The Son is, this is prior to the incarnation. He's the exact imprint, right? An extension of the Father, in a sense, right? The one who bears all creation together by his powerful word. That's who he is before he becomes human. And then we transition into what he did. There's a lot that the writer wants to say about this, but in a summary statement, there's the claim of sacrificial atonement, that he made purification for our sins. Having done that, having made purification for our sins, this is what he does when he enters into the heavenly tabernacle. We'll see that in Hebrews 9 and 10. When he does that, then he definitively takes his seat and is enthroned as the king and the priest of the heavenly tabernacle. And that's the event that Hebrews is most focused on. And then as a result of that, he has inherited this name that is superior to the angels, as superior as he is excellent. And then that leads into the scripture quotations, which is all going to support this. So I thought just spend a few minutes talking you through kind of what's going on there. We don't necessarily have to cover every single one, but if I miss something that you'd like to discuss, please feel free. What's going on here, I think at a basic level, is the juxtaposition of two types of beings. There's the idea that angels, these are created as God's heavenly ministers to minister in God's heavenly temple and also for the benefit of humanity. But the heirs of salvation are children of Abraham, flesh and blood human beings. And the particular position of humanity as exalted in the new creation is what needs to be established. And so Jesus is being highlighted as that Messiah who's become a human for us, who's lived and died and is now raised and brought into heaven, and he's exalted as the heavenly king above the angels. So that's kind of like at a basic level what's going on with the argument and the logic of how these texts are being worked together. This is the logic of how these texts are working together. Imagine that they're all being applied to God speaking to Jesus as he enters into heavenly space in his ascension of enthronement. You're basically getting a picture into that scene in heaven. This is what's happening in these texts, in these Old Testament texts, in light of the Son. So, like, for example, you see the first two texts. The connection here, I think, is pretty obvious. We have a quotation of Psalm 2:7. And notice that this is the supporting claim. To which of the angels did God ever say? So the idea is all these texts are not for angels. They're for the Son, the Messiah. And we get then a quotation of Psalm 2:7. You are my son, today I've begotten you. You see that text show up applied to Jesus' resurrection as it is here. It's also used in his baptismal scene when God sees his son. You are my son, beloved, right? So that's then being linked together with this other Messiah text, 2 Samuel 7:14, about David's seed, where he says, or again, I will be his father and he will be my son. So you can see these texts are being connected together based on the father-son relationship. These are about the Messiah, the Messianic ruler, and they're being linked here together to talk about Jesus's enthronement. Verse 6 is interesting. And when he brings his firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. This is from two texts that are being drawn together, a psalm and the end of Moses' song in Deuteronomy 32. And there is a little bit of a debate here over what we mean by bringing him into the world. So there's basically three different options there. And I'll give you, if you want, I can give you my preference. One is when he comes into the world, that is to say, in his incarnation. When he comes into the world, the angels recognize him and bow down before him. That's one option. The second option, which I lean towards, is that the world being discussed here is the new creation that he enters into. This is referenced also in chapter 2. So that's why I think it works well here. The other reason why I think it's referencing the new world that he enters into is because all of these other texts are being applied to that. So this would be the one instance where we move temporally back to incarnation away from resurrection and enthronement, if that were the case. And then some scholars suggest maybe this is a reference to the return of Jesus. That is to say, in his second coming, when he comes back into the world. So those are the three options that are given. I think you can make a case for incarnation, but I tend to read the world that he's entered into as part of the same scene, that when the Son is brought into the heavenly, the new world, the new creation, that the ministering angels there bow down before him and recognize him. And I think this works really well with the argument in chapter 2 also. Okay, and then he goes on of the angels. So rather than speaking directly to the Son, this is what he says of the angels. He makes his angels winds and his servants flames of fire. So in terms of the ontology, humans and angels are different types of beings. And the Son, while angels can minister on behalf of human beings, they can't save human beings, right? Jesus became fully human and is raised as a human, on our behalf. There's a distinction there. Yeah.
Just to go back real quick to your point previously.
Yeah.
Because everything that you just said about it being in the incarnation or in the world that he's entering into, or in his enthronement, would all be reasons. It has to be one of those three options, but it can't be some kind of future. You couldn't. That's the thing that guards against using these verses as an argument against eternal generation, right, of the Son, like, or the eternity of the second person of the Trinity. Like that's the thing that sometimes, he says, "I will be to him a father."
Yes. Great. I'm so glad you asked that question. Yes, some of the Son language, right?
Yeah.
If you press the metaphor, like. When we think about father-son relationships, right? The Son always comes after the Father. There's a point in time in which the Son comes into being, correct? Yeah. And what's going on here in this language is it's in the way Hebrews is using it and the way other New Testament writers are using it. It's not that Jesus becomes the Son in his incarnation, but it's that the language is it's performative, right? It's like when you are at a wedding ceremony and you say "I do." It's at that moment that the wedding is kind of consummated or whatever. The "you are my son" language is like that's the moment where the king is enthroned, right? So it's kind of like it's establishing Jesus as enthroned in power. It's not that he wasn't already the second person of the Trinity, but now he's the second person of the Trinity who's taken on humanity, who's been crucified, who's been raised from the dead, and is being enthroned in heaven. And that's new. The Son was always with the Father, but the Son was not always a human being with the Father. Right? So it's a new moment in terms of salvation of humanity and divinity being joined together. That's where it's different. But in terms of eternal generation, the Father-Son metaphor is stretched to say the Father has always been the Father and therefore always needs the Son. And the Son is always an extension of the Father in that way. Right? So it's like two different things, I would say. Yeah. Is that helpful? Okay. Yeah. It gets into some really interesting. So we have a really easy idea talking about Jesus as God, even though grasping that is hard to fully. But we're good with Jesus being God. But sometimes we struggle to think about Jesus being fully human as well. Maybe because the implications of that would be like, well, then you actually have to imitate Jesus. I don't know. But Hebrews is definitely focused on this idea of what it means that Jesus has taken on our humanity and has brought humanity into the presence of God. And in terms of the economy of salvation, this is a new moment, right? This is the first fruits of what will be when we're all made fully like Jesus and are in the presence of God. It doesn't mean that we all of a sudden become the creator like he is, but in all other respects, we become like him so that we can be fully in the presence of God. And Hebrews sees this moment of the Son coming before the Father as like super important. This is humanity and divinity, coming together in a really important way where Jesus is bringing our humanity before God's presence. And part of that gets to why the whole high priest thing is so important, right? It's kind of, one other thing I just wanted to point out, because I just think it's so fascinating about this whole argument. If you read on, so there's some more Messiah stuff in verse 9, where it uses the language of God, your God says to you, so you have Jesus there being called God by God. I mean, that's really remarkable. It's coming right out of Psalm 45. So what it actually shows you is that in certain contexts, the king of Israel could be called Elohim, God, in a certain respect. What I think is even more remarkable is actually beginning in verse 10, because what's directly connected here is with that one word "and," the implication is that the Father is still speaking to the Son, right? And now you have God, the Father, saying to the Son. So this is God, the Father, speaking to the Son in the enthronement, recalling what they did at the beginning of creation. It's kind of like they're celebrating, looking back retrospectively on their work in creation, as now they brought about the beginning of new creation. But that's pretty remarkable. This is what the Father says to the Son. In the beginning, Lord, you founded and the heavens are the works of your hands. So it actually places Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, places him in a pretty active role here in terms of creation. They will perish, but you will remain. They will all wear out like clothing, like a cloak, they will roll them up. Like clothing, they will change, but you are the same and your years will never end. Right. So this is God the Father speaking to the Son about their work in creation. And I think that is really remarkable, reading Psalm text and Isaiah text in light of that. And then, of course, it culminates in the quotation of Psalm 110, which is the big one that's quoted throughout Hebrews. Psalm 110:1 is quoted here. Which of the angels has it ever said, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet"? That's Psalm 110:1. That's where we get the image of the Son enthroned at the right hand of God the Father. The other part of that psalm that will become very important is verse 4, where the figure that's enthroned at the right hand, God says to this figure, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." So that's another part that's coming, and that's implicit here. But right now it's just focusing on this Jesus being seated there at the right hand. So again, there's a lot of really interesting interpretive activity going on here on the part of the writer speaker, where texts from various parts of the Old Testament are being woven together into a coherent speech of God the Father speaking to the Son. And the occasion is the Son's enthronement in heaven. And all of this is in support of making the point of who the Son is as a human being, the incarnate one, not, as it were, an angel of a different kind of substance. And then he concludes in verse 14, "Are not all angels spirits in the service, sent to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation?" So there's several, I kind of touched on a couple of these points already, but in terms of different questions, in verse 9, it mentions the Son being exalted above his companions or his peers. And you could read that in a couple of different ways. Does that mean, are his companions, peers here, other angels in heaven? Possible. I think in light of the argument of chapters 1 and 2, more likely he's the exalted human, representative of all other humans. Getting again back to this point that the Messiah is the human representative. He's not an angel. So that's how I tend to read that, and that's where the argument is headed in chapter 2. So he's going to unpack this more fully. What does it mean that Jesus is the human being who serves on behalf of all other human beings? So this was a very intricate opening to this sermon, kind of gets your attention like, wow, this is good stuff. Now at this point, the preacher steps back, and this is where we get the first of the warning texts. And this is actually the mildest of the warning texts. So this is what he writes. "Therefore, we must pay greater attention to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away." And that's the consistent theme of don't drift away, don't fall away, right? In the sermon. "For if the message declared through angels proved valid, and every transgression or disobedience received a just penalty, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? It was declared at first through the Lord, and it was confirmed by those who heard him, while God added his testimony by signs and wonders and various miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. So there's a little bit of, again, of this kind of looking back and looking forward again. This is how I understand the rhetoric of Hebrews. So sometimes people have this idea that Hebrews is negative on Old Testament stuff, right? It's like, oh, that stuff's bad, or it's past, we're done with it, kind of thing. I don't think that's how Hebrews looks at it. I think Hebrews looks at it as like, that was really good, but now we've reached the definitive moment. So the logic is always from really good to best, not from bad to good, as sometimes we do in church with like bad Old Testament, good New Testament work. It goes from really good to ultimate is kind of the idea. And that also, though, has implications for the warning passages, because it's like, if there was judgment in the past, how much more severe will it be now in light of this definitive revelation? So that's part of how the rhetoric also then works for these warning texts. What's being said here, we'll get into longer warning texts in the next class when we get into the wilderness. You might have missed it, but here the allusion is to the giving of the law to Moses. And we know the story there. When the law was given, what did the people do initially? They made an idol, right? They fell into idolatry. And that was an instance where God demonstrated his incredible grace, actually. We get God's revelation, the Lord slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, forgiving 1,000 generations, but also holding the guilty to account up until the third and fourth generation. So you get God's mercy abounding along with God's justice. And that's the kind of classic confession throughout the Old Testament. This is who God is. He's the God of grace and mercy. And the trick is not just for you, but also for your enemy, right? Jonah found that out the hard way. So God's this God of incredible grace, but there is also judgment. So we know in the story that's what happens. And the idea here is in the giving of the law, there was this judgment. How much more so now in light of the fullness of salvation that's come in Christ, right? That's kind of the way that the argument works. The reference of the law being given by angels, typically in most Jewish traditions, and including here in Hebrews, this is seen as a positive thing. It speaks to the nature of how important the law is. So the idea is, yes, moving from good to ultimate, and therefore past judgment can also be seen as warning for the seriousness of the present. I want to anticipate, we're going to talk a lot about the rhetoric of the warning passages, because that's a big question that people have with Hebrews. What do we do with all these texts that talk about the potential for people to lose their salvation, I guess we could say. And I think the writer is actually quite careful in terms of how he does it, but he definitely does want us to take very seriously these warnings, that now is the time to respond, as long as it is today. As he says, don't harden your hearts. Listen to the voice of God, persevere. So it tends to be, again, we'll get more into detail, but it tends to be very, very intense, but ultimately encouraging. I know he doesn't just say hold fast, he says, I know you're going to hold fast, right? Which is, I think, helpful. And he also reminds the audience of times where they've held fast in the past under intense persecution. There's a lot more we're going to say about that. And also, I want to talk about what happens when Christians do fall and stumble. Because part of the reason that Hebrews had a bit of a checkered past, especially in the Western church, is that there were these cases where, under intense persecution, bishops and other leaders renounced the faith in the face of intense persecution, and then after the fact wanted to repent and come back. And Hebrews became this text like, can they do that or not, right? And so we'll talk about what the church did then as well. Okay, very good. So that's the first warning section. And the last thing that I want to do is look at the argument in the rest of chapter 2. And this is very much continuing on this idea of Jesus as the representative human on behalf of humanity. We get a more detailed explanation of why it is that he had to become human to save us. All right, so in terms of the structure of the argument, let me just lay that out, and then we'll walk our way through it. We get in 2:5, we get the central claim about the world to come. Again, it's the same term for world that was used in 1:6. So I'm making that connection here, that it's the same world that we're talking about. This world to come, the world into which the Son enters. And that's to be subject to human beings. Human beings are the image bearers of God, designed to reign and rule over God's good creation. That was messed up in the fall. but that's what will be fully restored in the new creation. So that's the first part then. And then we get the scriptural argument from Psalm 8, which is really interesting. The argument that the writer makes actually only works if you go with the Greek rendition of the psalm. As there's a couple moves that are made there that you need the Greek version to make. So he reads Psalm 8 in a very distinctive way, and we'll talk about that. And then he spells out what that means, the Christological implications, that there's the lowering of the Son beneath the angels in the incarnation and in his suffering, and then the exaltation of the Son in the world to come. And then the rest of the argument breaks down. So we have in 2:10, we have the assertion that this way of doing it was fitting, that the Son would take on our humanity. We have a series of scriptural texts that are read now as the Son speaking back to the Father. So in chapter 1, we've had God the Father speaking to the Son. Now it's the Son speaking back to the Father, and speaking in particular on behalf of his siblings, other human beings. So it's Jesus bringing the voices, confessing his brothers and sisters before God the Father as he speaks back. And then a statement about Jesus basically carving the way to new life, his victory over death, and his installment as the high priest, beginning to tease some ideas that will be spelled out more fully in the rest of the sermon. So that's the kind of the remainder of what we have to cover, and I think we should be able to do it. We're making good headway, so that's good. I wasn't sure if we'd get through the whole thing, but I think we will. So let me go ahead and read. I'm going to read the first few verses, and then we'll break this down. So chapter 2, verse 5. You can hear the writer's picking back up with the argument, right? You just had that warning section. And now in verse 5, it's marked in the Greek that it's picking back up with the argument that was kind of ended at verse 14 of chapter 1. So that line of argument, we're just picking it back up. Now God did not subject the coming world about which we are speaking to angels, but someone has testified somewhere. It's kind of a funny way of quoting scripture. Someone said somewhere, right? We actually do have other examples from contemporary Jewish authors who do this sometimes with the scriptures. So it's not as weird as you might think, but it is kind of funny. Like somebody says it somewhere, right? And then this is in fact a quotation from Psalm 8. And I'm actually going to read, I'll translate it out of the Greek because it does kind of matter how you translate it in order to hear the exact rhetoric. So what is this humanity, anthropos, that you remember them, or him, right? Because it's singular human, or the Son of Man, that you are mindful of him. So what we have paralleled here is it's called synonymous parallelism, right? In Hebrew poetry, where you're not saying exactly the same thing. Maybe there's a little bit of development, but it's kind of more or less stating the same thing, where humanity and the Son of Man are more or less the same synonymous terms, right? Not exactly for Hebrews. So the way that the writer is reading that is that the Son of Man is, Jesus is called the Son of Man in many places, but this is a term you get from like Daniel 7:13, the one like a son of man. And that text is being read also in light of Psalm 8. And so what we have then is that it is all of humanity, but it's Jesus, the Son of Man, as the representative for all of humanity. So it's like he's the human par excellence, is how I think Hebrews is parsing these two terms. And then it says, made him, that is the Son of Man, for a little while lower than the angels. Now, that's a reading that's only possible in the Greek text. The Greek is translated to Hebrew, I think, fine. It's a kind of character for character translation at this point. But the Hebrew text can't really be taken temporally. The Hebrew text version can only be taken in terms of degree, made a little lower. The Greek text, I think, meant that in the translation, but the writer is taking advantage of the fact that you can read it temporally. So it's not just a little lower, but it's for a little while. And that allows the writer to coordinate the Christ event and reading it in light of the psalm, where you have that little while, as he's going to explain, refers to the incarnation. Okay, so you made him a little lower than the angels, and then crowned him with glory and honor, subjecting all things under his feet. So you can read this as what's for all humanity, that's how it's intended. It's for all humanity. The psalm is a meditation on creation, right? Lower than. The other thing why it works in the Greek is where it's lower than the angels, right? In the Hebrew text, the word there is Elohim, and we typically translate it as you made it a little lower than God, referring to in creation, humans are made in the image of God, right? But you can also take Elohim as a plural reference as divine beings or whatever, right? Like the angels are below God. And that is what ends up happening here in the Greek. And that allows then for the comparison between the Son and the angels to continue. So this is what I mean by this comparison only works in the Greek tradition. It's one indication of the writer's engagement with Greek, what we call Septuagint textual traditions. So then we have so you're subjecting all things under his feet, and then he explains it for us. Now, in subjecting all things to the Son of Man, my English translation says them, but I think him is better here. The him is Jesus as the representative for them, all of humanity. In subjecting all things to him, God left nothing outside of his control. And then he says, as it is, we do not yet see everything subject to him. Why? Because, well, just look around the world, right? We can say Jesus is in control, and that is ultimately true. He is in control, but the world is also broken. It's chaotic. We don't always see the kingdom of God fully manifested in our world. So he's just making that observation. But he says, we do see Jesus. That's the first time Jesus' name has been mentioned so far in the sermon, too. I think kind of the name has been rhetorically held off. He's been speaking in terms of the Son throughout, and now we have the build up to the name Jesus. We do see Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels. Okay, so that's what I'm getting at with that particular reading of the Psalm text. Reading that line temporally, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. So again, writers reading these distinct temporal moments in his incarnation and suffering, humiliation, made lower than the angels, raised to glory, crowned with glory and honor, receiving basically taking the rightful place of humanity in creation as he enters into the new creation. So it's a distinct reading of this part of Psalm 8. Reading the ultimate destiny of humanity in light of the Christ event, in light of Jesus' incarnation, resurrection. So this is, and it works because he's the human par excellence. He's the representative for all of humanity, right? Is kind of how it is the argument. So this is just my own breakdown. Again, we have the shift between one and the other. And also the recognition that we, like Jesus experienced in his humiliation, we will also experience trial, suffering, and death. And the writer deals with that throughout the sermon. But we can expect that. There should be challenges and struggles in this life because not everything, the new heavens and new earth haven't fully come yet. Jesus has entered into that space, but they hasn't taken over this current, present, dying creation. So we don't fully see that reality manifested yet in our creation. We see the glimpses of it. But we do see Jesus. We look to him who's gone ahead of us. He's carved the path out to life, is the idea. And so in him becoming human and him dying, he has experienced, right? This is the idea, experienced death for every human being. And as he's going to go on, he's also overcome death. I like how the one scholar puts it. This is again from Craig Kester's commentary. He writes this: Christ's death is both exemplary and salvific. Then we see this throughout Hebrews. Christ is both exemplary, the example to be followed, and salvific, the thing that saves us. Being crowned with glory and honor because of suffering and death is exemplary in that glory and honor are connected to faithfulness and hardship and to the humility of the one who did not consider it shameful to identify with humankind. Jesus' example is demanding in that those who follow him are to lay sin aside and persevere. We'll see examples of that when we look at the perseverance stuff, enduring the reproach that Christ endured. Yet Christ's example is also reassuring. Since Christ suffered and was exalted to God's right hand, the followers of Christ who suffer can hope for a place in the unshakable kingdom. The glory given to God's Son anticipates the glory of all God's sons and daughters. Amen. That's pretty good. All right, so moving on. Why it is fitting right? That's the argument made. It was fitting that God did this. He writes, for whom and through whom all things exist, in bringing many children to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through suffering. And then he says, for the one who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one Father. For this reason, Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters, saying, and then we get a series of texts where Jesus speaks back to the Father, confessing humanity as brothers and sisters. I'll talk about that more in a second. Let me just make a couple comments about these verses here. So this last section that we're looking at here is further support explanation of God's decision to send the Son's decision to come to take on our humanity. Right. So it's further unpacking the logic of why that was the case. Leading many children to glory. So the Son being the representative that's discussed of all humanity that's discussed in Psalm 8. He's the first of many sons and daughters who are being made into his image, and he uses the language of a pioneer or a founder, an archegos, the one who establishes the new way, founds the new way. This is a question that comes up when we study Hebrews. I'll make a comment here, and we can maybe talk about it more in weeks to come. It's the first of several references where it said that God Father made the Son perfect or complete. And that's another one where you stop and you're like, wait, what's going on here? How can the second person of the Trinity not be perfect, right? God is perfect. The key here is to recognize how perfection language is being used. The word is teleao, which has to do with reaching an end goal. So we think of something that's perfect or complete. It's arrived at that complete state. It shows up in places in the sermon where the writer's talking about what Jesus had to go through all the way up into his resurrection. And I think what's going on is perfection language it's being applied in a particular way. The perfecting of humanity, that Jesus came and experienced the human experience, learned obedience through that experience, and then was raised by God and brought into this perfected state of humanity. So it's more talking about the completed arc of the human story that Jesus entered into on our behalf, not in terms of wasn't God or something like that, right? So that's sort of how the perfection language, I think, is working in a nutshell. But we can look at more examples of that in the weeks ahead. So he says Jesus was made perfect in this way. And then the statement, the one who sanctifies and those who are sanctified. In Greek, it just says are from the one. And the word one here could be, in terms of Greek, has the nouns always have gender. So the form could either be masculine or neuter. If it's masculine, the one is a reference to God, the Father. If you read it as neuter, which I tend to read it here, it's from the one substance. That is to say, the Son of flesh and blood, in the same ways that human beings are of flesh and blood. In reality, it's not a huge difference because we're all of the Father and Jesus shares flesh and blood. It's just a question of what grammatically is going on here. But I think that the emphasis is on him sharing our very nature, our flesh and blood, the Son taking that on. This part is really cool. It's another one of my favorite parts. So I love the fact that in chapter 1, we have God the Father speaking to the Son and reminiscing, the Father enthroning the Son and then reflecting with the Son on their active creation. In chapter 2, you get the Son speaking back to the Father, and he's not just speaking to the Father on his own behalf, but on behalf of us as well. So it's a really cool picture of Jesus coming before God and as a human, speaking on behalf of us, other human beings. One of the texts that's cited here, I'll proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters, and that's the congregation, I'll praise you. That's actually from the end of Psalm 22, which is really cool. Because if you think about Psalm 22 in the New Testament, where else does it show up? It shows up at the crucifixion, right? That's where we get the my God, why have you forsaken me? So you get actually then the full arc of Psalm 22 in the New Testament, where Jesus enters into the suffering and abandonment for humanity in the crucifixion. And then at the end of the psalm, when the psalmist is vindicated, this is Jesus vindicated, resurrected, confessing God and confessing his brothers and sisters, other human beings before God. So it's a really kind of cool arc that you can trace there. All of these texts are the Son then speaking back to God on behalf of other human beings. Verse 14, how are we doing? Yeah, I think we can finish. Since therefore the children share flesh and blood, right? This is what I'm getting back to, that of the same substance language. He himself likewise shared the same things, so that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. Maybe Exodus logic going on there, right? Like the devil being the ultimate Pharaoh who keeps people in slavery, and the Son coming in and liberating them from the fear of death by overcoming death. For it is clear that he did not come to help angels, but the descendants of Abraham. Therefore, he had to become like his brothers and sisters in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make a sacrifice of atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself was tested by what he suffered, he is able to help those who are being tested. So it's further spelling out the logic of why he had to become fully human. So we get the language of, again, full participation in our humanity, taking on our very flesh and blood. That recalls the earlier confession in the psalm that Jesus was anointed above his peers. We get the language of the term I'm using here, Christus Victor, just meaning Christ the victor, a way of kind of encapsulating this theme that we have in the New Testament, that Jesus conquered death, right? And that's a statement that's made powerfully here, that he entered into this reality, took on sin and death, and overcame that for us, and has gone ahead of us and has liberated us from that reality, right? Speaking to his victory there over the devil, which does not play a big role in Hebrews. Hebrews is more focused on things like the sacrifice of Jesus and so forth, but that is mentioned here at the outset. We get the language of the high priest, right? So becoming like his siblings in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. This is teasing an idea that's central to the sermon that we're going to look at more. Jesus as the high priest. Hebrews later talks about, this is in chapter 4 and then chapter 5, that the high priest is like all other human beings, a human mediator for all other humans, right? Who is the high priest? It's the one that's taken out of all other humans to serve on behalf of humans in the tabernacle before God. And so because the high priest shares in the humanity with all other human beings, he is able to sympathize with them, with human weakness. So that's the logic that's drawn out, that same kind of way. He shares in their weaknesses in the same way, the effects of human mortality. The difference with Jesus, as the writer will say, is that Jesus did all these things, but without sin. So Jesus shares in our humanity in all respects, and including our weaknesses, the writer says. He fully participates in human mortality. The experience is connected with that, but he does it without sin, right? That's what makes it unique. That's what makes him different than any other human being. But otherwise, he's completely like us. And so that means he's able to understand us. He is merciful, right? Recognize that he's not just God, obviously just displaying God's nature of mercy, but also from an experiential understanding of what it means to be human. He's merciful and he's faithful, constantly true to his task as high priest. There's never a moment where Jesus is in the heavenly tabernacle and kind of like drops the ball, so to speak, right? He's always ministering on our behalf. This is why it's such good news as a Christian, right? When you follow God, you're not just like praying a prayer and then saying, all right, I'm just going to try to bootstrap it for the rest of my time here on earth or whatever. You are following in the example of Jesus by the power of the Holy Spirit. And at every moment, Jesus is interceding on your behalf as your high priest. At any moment, we can go to the throne of mercy and call upon the high priest. That's incredible, right? That's an ongoing reality. So it's in terms of like thinking about the Christian life, it's really all revolving around who Jesus is and where he is on our behalf, constantly ministering for us, right, is kind of the idea. And then the point about the sacrifice for atonement, that's when we're going to need to get more into the sacrificial system. This is teasing an idea that gets laid out in quite a bit of detail in Hebrews. To anticipate where this goes, Hebrews is using the model of Leviticus 16, which is the Day of Atonement. And that's the one day out of the year where the high priest enters into the Holy of Holies and sprinkles blood before the mercy seat. Hebrews says that's what Jesus does, but he does it in the heavenly tabernacle. And instead of going in and leaving, he actually enters in and stays in there and is constantly there. Therefore, we have a human being, representative of humanity, in the heavenly holy of holies at all times, interceding for us until he comes back and returns. So Hebrews looks at the return of Jesus as akin to the moment where the high priest leaves the tabernacle after making the sacrifice. So it's like the sacrifice has been made for us. Jesus is now ministering for us, and he's going to come out of the tent and return. I can't tell you exactly when, but at some point. It's kind of the idea. And then the last statement, he endured this time of trial, and so therefore he's able to help his siblings. The idea is, well, there's a lot of perseverance language in Hebrews. There's a lot of striving, like we're supposed to put forth our effort. We're supposed to follow in the example of Jesus. But it's just precisely that he's there helping us along the way as we follow in his footsteps. So Hebrews 1 and 2, really, really powerful stuff. I mean, we could probably just have done 4 classes just on these 2 chapters. But in a nutshell, we have the whole suite of the Christ event of Jesus prior to his incarnation, taking on our humanity for us, living faithfully, dying faithfully, being raised as our representative. All of that's there in the first 2 chapters of Hebrews. And the emphasis is on that end point of the arc, where he took his seat at the right hand of God. And now we're supposed to reflect on that reality and live our lives in light. Okay, so that's about the time we have for tonight. But any questions, comments? Yeah.
I'll on the Psalm 8 quote and the Septuagint versus the Hebrew. How does that inform a nuanced Orthodox view of inerrancy and fallibility?
Oh, yeah. That's it's a big question.
That might
I think at the level of in terms of which text you go with, there are some different textual traditions of the Old Testament. Let's put it that way. And in some cases, it's not entirely clear which one you go with. I would probably, in most cases, tend to go with the best Hebrew one that we have. But there are plenty of places where the Septuagint tradition may be better. And our English Bibles often do default to that, although they use the Hebrew as the base text. I think inerrancy tends to be more at the level, at least classically for Christianity, more at the level of the sensus of the text, the underlying meaning of the text. And the church has always been aware of some differences in terms of wording in textual traditions. So I don't think it would be a problem for kind of a classical doctrine of inerrancy in terms of how church fathers and others understood the reality, like that there are textual differences and they can testify in different ways. But if you had a really restrictive view of we got to know exactly to the word on everything, and it's got to be Hebrew and not Greek and stuff, the New Testament could provide some challenges to that, because in many instances the writers are quoting Greek traditions that have some differences to the Hebrew traditions, and part of that's just the nature of text. Like in the old, they didn't have printed fixed text the way that we do, right? So every text is going to be a little bit different. But what they do, at least in antiquity, is focus a lot on the underlying sense of the text. And they seem to be okay with little differences in words and things like that. But the New Testament authors have no problem using the textual traditions that help their theological argument. That's just the reality. And that's not uncommon. That's how Jews of the period read their scriptures. Early church fathers, rabbis, they do similar things. So, we can talk a lot more about that if you like. I'm going to be happy to, because I find this stuff fascinating. It's one of my really areas of research in my academic work is how Jews and Christians read ancient texts and all this kind of stuff. So if you ever want to chat about it, I'd be happy to. Hey, anything else? Anybody online? If you have any questions or thoughts or anything like that? All right, sounds good. So to anticipate where we're going next week, we're going to be in the wilderness. So we're going to focus a lot on chapters 3 and 4. I'll probably hit on a couple other things as well, but I want to really hone in on the motif of what it means to be the wilderness people of God, responding to God in the wilderness, testing and trials and things like that the writer talks about. So that's kind of where we're going. If you think of any questions or things that you'd like to discuss in class, you can always send me an email, and I'll be happy to work it into the class, because this is for you guys. I want this to be beneficial for you. So if you have things that you're like, hey, please make sure you talk about this, send me an email, and be happy to do so. All right. Okay. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next Tuesday.